Hello and welcome to the code behind datGravity, my new remake thing of the thing. So someone was asking for some overview of how everything works, and so this is that. First we set the margin and padding on everything to 0 so that everything will kind of be placed exactly where I want it and I won't have to worry about any extra stuff from the CSS. This is style information. Make the background black. Put this bit here with the link and the paragraph tag, that's the P and the A, is so that this little bit of text here appears in the bottom left where I want it without interrupting things. And then of course there's all these scripts and a canvas. So that's very, very simple. The meat of the program is in a function in a place called main, which has a lot of commented out code and is kind of shit. Needs to be redone. But we have an object called game. It has a function to generate a new system, another one to generate asteroids. I'm going to kind of glance over these things, but there's a function called system, which is down here, which creates a system. It's supposed to generate a system, but right now it just generates the same thing every single time. It's all very simple, but basically, let's see. Asteroids are generated a random number between 1 and 5. They're given a location and stuff. It's kind of too complicated to just really quickly, simply say it. But it does that. Oh yes, and then there's this, which I need to figure out how to do that. There's also this loop function, which does this is the main game loop. This is what we do here. It compares each object in bodies and applies gravity to them. And then it compares them to see if any of them collide and combines the ones that do, clears the screen, then for each item it updates the location and then draws it on the screen. Then there's some player stuff where it checks the input to see if the the velocity needs to change, then it moves the player, and then it sets a timeout so that the loop will repeat. Technically you're supposed to use a function called request animation frame to do this, but I need to learn how that works if I'm going to do that. Then we add an event listener so that when the page loads, it'll generate a new system and start the game loop. This is the player move function, which basically does the same thing as for bodies, but it's specific to the player and needs to be fixed and changed probably. And I've already mentioned system, so I guess I'm going to go over to the objects, which has a bit of crap at the front for telling it how it's loading. Everything is a body, and the objects, which have colors, names, x, y, and rotation speed. Then there's planetoids, which have a radius and a mass value, and there's ships, which additionally have a width and a height and mass calculated based on width and height, and 0.141, which is based off of the density of liquid oxygen, because this is eventually going to be used as a fuel tank, and ships are going to be created completely differently. Moving on to physics, there's this function to combine bodies when they collide, which basically takes the mass, the name, and the color of the bigger one, and it fixes the focus ID if it needs to, based on how how ID values change. It checks where the mass should be, calculates force, adds the mass together, applies the force, recalculates the radius based on the new mass, and then it places it in the correct location using this maths here, which I could do its whole own video on, and maybe I will on another channel, like a how-to physics or something like that. I don't know. There's the render code, which there's an object called render, which handles all that stuff, so there's some values here. These are ones you might have noticed in the other video, iteration delay, how fast it's going, render type, whether it fades or not, the fade alpha to use, the focus type, focus ID, and the scale. There's a clear function which depending on whether you have fade set or not, it'll apply a fade effect or it'll just clear. There's a draw, which is a bit more complicated and does some maths to determine where to draw the object, and then draws it, which is where I need to fix something because something breaks somewhere when I did something in that other video. Oh yes, add event listener loads. So this one has its own little bit that needs to be done when it loads. The canvas and context, as you can see, are set to null. So once the page actually loads, so we can access that element in the document, the canvas element, then we actually load it in, and it says render loaded. There's also this bit here which will automatically resize when you change the size of the screen, the window that it's running in. This where it says this should be handled differently. Part of that's because I need to implement some sort of redraw thing with that, and the other thing is that it should be using window.add event listener instead of just saying window.onResize equals function. And the reason why is because you see how I have add event listener here with load, and then over in main I have another add event listener with load. Now, if those were just window.onLoad equals function blah blah blah, only one of them would actually work. The other one would not. And so that's something to be avoided, obviously. We go over to the IO file. It has an array called keys held, and then it has some event listeners for key down and key up. If a key is pushed down, keys held, the key code, is true. If it's put up, it's set to false. So the check input, where is it? Game loop check input right here. That function is in the IO right here, check input, and that basically just checks the keys held for particular codes, which represent WASD and the up, left, down, and right arrows, and applies a change to the velocity of ship at focus ID, which would be the ship that you're controlling. And right now they just are hard-coded to change it by 1. Later on that will be, different. This is the code that makes the GUI work. Graphical User Interface, for those of you not in the know, which some of you may not know that, I don't know. This bit here is checking if the things are loaded, because by default this will try to run because it's run down here. This is just declaring the function. Actually, it's an object with the function in it. This down here is telling it to actually run. So what we need to do is check if things are actually loaded, because if dat for dat GUI is not loaded, and if game is not created, and if render is not created, the rest of this will break. So we need to make sure that it's working. If it isn't, it'll say it's not ready, and it'll set a timeout to reload. Else, it'll continue on. So it sets up the dat GUI, which is everything's under this GUI object. There's the main GUI. We add a folder called functions. So you can see here, add folder, generate new system, generate asteroids. There's the render settings folder with all this render stuff. And as you can see, there's default values. For instance, the iteration delay, rather than just being a number, it has max, FPS 60, FPS 30, FPS 10, and min, which are all these various different values. Physics, of course, has its own stuff and its own limits and whatnot. It's fairly simple. Then there's the body stuff, which I hate and is horrible, and just don't even look at that. Then there's this function that doesn't exist yet, so don't look at that either. So yeah, that's basically what I'm working on. Oh, I accidentally typed some code in here while starting the recording. So what have I done here? Probably just done the same thing by accident. Alright, so that's basically how the code works. Oh yes, and then here's how gravity works. It's kind of complicated. I don't want to go into it right now. Again, that could be its whole own video on how to do stuff. There's also a set orbit function, which also could be its whole own video, and then calculate barycenter, which I'm not quite sure even works properly, and could be its whole own video. There's also update location, which could be its... Actually, that one's fairly simple. There's vectors, and that's about everything. Thanks for watching. As always, I probably did a terrible job at this, but yeah. See you in space.